How do you create irresistible podcast pitches that are going to get you booked on podcasts? Over the years, I've tried a lot of different strategies when it comes to sending out podcast pitches to podcast hosts. I've seen what works. I've definitely seen what doesn't work. So, in today's video, if you're watching on YouTube, today's podcast episode, if you're listening on the podcast, what I want to talk about is how to create irresistible podcast pitches. First thing I want to talk about is what you don't want to do, and that's to send the same exact pitch to every single podcast host, making it cookie cutter, not putting anything specific to that podcast host themselves, because at the end of the day, there's been a lot more increase in competition of folks wanting to go out there and be a guest on podcasts. So if your pitch doesn't send out, all the podcast host is going to do is just delete the email, and that's going to be the end of it. You're not going to have that podcast appearance. So you want to send out podcast pitches that hosts want to see. Another strategy I have found that didn't work was sending out very long podcast pitches. You want to keep it to about, maybe 8 to 10 sentences. It really doesn't have to be that long. And I'll tell you where you can include more of your information in talking about how to create these irresistible podcast pitches. It really doesn't have to be that long, because if you're a podcast host and you're getting a pitch and you're opening up your phone and you're checking your email and you're getting 3 to 5 paragraphs long, maybe 5 to 6 sentences each, it's just way too much information to digest. So the first step that I found that in creating irresistible podcast pitches was giving a specific compliment to the podcast host. So I'll say something as simple as, hey, podcast host name, I recently listened to your episode with Trevor Oldham. I really enjoyed you guys discussing the benefits of podcast guesting. Podcast guesting has been something that I've been considering doing myself, and I found the interview to be very informative. Just something simple like that. And then you put, I would like to introduce you to, let's say, Trevor. Let's just continue using my name. I'd like to introduce you to Trevor. He can provide value to your audience by teaching them how they can take their social media interviews and take their interviews and turn them into social media clips to really expand their reach and take that next step against podcast guesting. Trevor's experience comes from founding the podcasting social media agency, where they've worked with over 400 clients to create more than 6,500 social media clips. And just something simple like that. As an appreciation for your podcast, I have left you a 5-star review. This is where you go into iTunes, you leave a 5-star review for the podcast host, and then you screenshot that 5-star review that you've created for the podcast host. And then from there, you include that in the email, because reviews are almost like the gold standard in podcasting. The more reviews you have, the better your podcast looks. It doesn't always be the way. I've seen almost like inflated reviews before at different podcasts where I just know the reviews aren't matching how many people are listening to this podcast. But nonetheless, it is very nice to receive a good podcast review. So you want to make sure that you're leaving podcast review. And then I say, if you want more information from this podcast, please, check out our one sheet here. I have a nice professional one sheet that includes questions to ask the guest, topics to ask the guest, more in-depth bio, previous podcast appearances that they've had, website, social media handles, basically everything that a podcast host is going to need is going to be within that one sheet, where the podcast host can read the email, then they can click over to the one sheet, bam, they get everything that they need right there. We're going to make it as simple and as easy as possible for the podcast host. That's the strategy right there. I mean, it's really not that complex, but the big components are not making it too long, making sure that you contain something specific and relevant to that podcast host's audience, and that you include a screenshot to the podcast host's podcast. I found that by doing that, even if I don't, the podcast host gets back to me, they're booked up, maybe I'm not an exact fit what they're looking for, they're very appreciative of me, and I'd rather hear back on a no, that no, it's just not the right fit for what we're looking to do right now, than just send out 10, 20 podcast pitches hear crickets, don't hear anything back. So at the end of the day, those are the exact steps that I recommend to take to create an irresistible podcast pitch.